Okay, welcome. I've been asked to represent CSEAS and introduce. Just want to note that there's a couple of events. I'm Professor Alan Hicken. I'm in the Political Science Department. There's a couple of events coming up on Southeast Asia. There's some flyers over there. Taste of Southeast Asia is coming up this week, put on by our language lecturers. I think it's today 2 to 4. So if you want some more good food after this, you can head over there and enjoy some of those offerings. We are really delighted today to have with us Dr. Sharmani, Patricia, Gabriel. She is an associate professor in the Department of English at the other U of M, the University of Malaya. She's a Fulbright recipient, and this year has been spending the year at our U of M, and we're delighted to have her. She had her PhD from University of Leeds in the UK. She works on post-colonial literary and cultural studies. She looks at things like ideology of home and nation, diaspora, minority communities, multiculturalism, identity politics, and questions of race and cultural translation. She's the co-editor of a recently published volume entitled Diasporic Identities and Spaces Between. She has an impressive list of publications. If I read them to you now, we would not have any time for her to actually speak, so I will not do that. But just note that her works appeared in places like Cultural Dynamics, Post-Colonial Text, Asia-European Journal, Inter-Asia Cultural Studies, the Atlantic Literary Review. A recent article in Critical Asian Studies was a finalist for the 2012 National Academic Award in Malaysia for the best article published that year. And in 2012, she was also chosen as the best lecturer at University of Malaya in Arts and Social Sciences. So delighted to have her with us today, and turn the floor over to her.
Thank you very much, Alan, for your kind words. And thank you much, everyone, for being here today and making some time to listen to me. Malaysia's high level of economic success has been extensively studied, but very little critical attention has been paid to its cultural narrative. Even when national or economic policies are placed under scrutiny, their cultural dimensions or implications are overlooked. My talk today is part of an ongoing effort to fill that gap. Race is the main discursive category around which has been constructed a system of socio-cultural power and exclusion. It is the most readily referenced signifier of difference in Malaysia. Written into public policies and practices and embedded into the formal structures and institutions of state, it is also an ascribed identity. One's race as a Malay, Chinese, Indian, or other, these are the officially sanctioned race categories in Malaysia. The offhand is MCIO. It is an ascribed identity, and cannot be changed. Malaysians are expected, if not required, to call up their assigned MCIO identity every time they are asked to tick one of 4 officially designated race boxes in a variety of administrative forms. Not only does the MCIO framework not account for the nation's cosmopolitan histories and cultural genealogies, it also fails to meet the range of contemporary Malaysian identities, which derive their complexity from contingent and fluid forms of identification and experience along the differential axis of not only race, but also class, religion, gender, age, and so on and so forth. Inevitably, this talk reflects my research interest, including the particular complexities and contradictions involved in the process of doing qualitative research that is concerned with the cultural functioning of society, how cultural narratives work, how cultural identities are constructed, both for individuals and by them in a context marked by state power and its own domains of interest, which may not necessarily be equitable or inclusive ones. The larger, more important goal for me is not to view race as a thing in and of itself, but as a prism through which broader social structures, processes, and possibilities can be explored. In fact, I would argue that the use of race as a lens to view Malaysian society is a way to think through some of the most pressing challenges facing Malaysia as a post-colonial nation state. I bring to this topic my disciplinary training in literary studies and a methodological as well as ideological perspective in the intersecting field of cultural studies. Although my work is influenced by post-colonial and post-structuralist notions and ideas of race and ethnicity, I am not a scholar of race. If by this it usually means that one is an expert on the sociology of race. I am more interested in understanding the processes behind the concept of race and in analyzing the effects of those processes. That is to say, my goal is not to study race as a category in itself, but to explore how it came to be as the result of processes, which means that if you shift those processes, race can mean different things. The important point then is that although it is persistently grounded in the naturalizing metaphors of blood and soil, race is a contested and provisional category involving socially produced and dynamic processes of being and becoming. Race and its meanings can be negotiated, reworked, and resisted by individuals. Race, in the Gramscian sense, is always a site of struggle. Although new developments and transitions in Malaysian society have created a much-needed space for critical reflection on the meaning of race and the impetus to rethink the dominant paradigm shaping Malaysian studies, new developments and transitions in Malaysian society have created a much-needed space for critical reflection. Since state and other hegemonic actors who benefit from dominant racial paradigms have a vested interest in maintaining them and tend to resist reform, it is imperative that the attempt to rethink race, I argue, is done at, from, and through the site of conceptual rupture that exists between how we have been represented and how we might represent ourselves. This rupture, I argue, also constitutes a seminal point for knowledge construction, a seminal point of departure for knowledge construction. This involves addressing the ways in which questions of race are approached in research. This also raises the other important question about the particular kinds of policy shifts that would be required in Malaysia in the wake of the cultural shifts happening on the ground. I feel this constitutes a neglected area of scholarship. Now, I want to take us back a bit into history. In Malaysia, the concept of race is bound in systems of power that derive their roots in British colonialism. There is inadequate time for me to go into any detail here, so I can only provide an outline of what is relevant to my argument, because it is the future narrative of race that interests me. But in order to move forward, we need to deal with history and the ways in which constructions of race and difference are produced and have effects on any historical moment. The central framing post-colonial question in my mind is this: can race as a colonial administrative invention capture the cultural complexities of post-colonial identities? The British introduced the notion of race as the primary identity to cater to their vested economic interests in Malaya. Race was used to determine people's place and function in the colonial economy. The strategy of divide and rule further created social and political distance between the different groups. The colonial division of labor, with its attendant identification of race with a particular economic role, left an indelible spatial imprint on the formation of Malaysia. While Indians were mostly recruited to work as coolies, Indians brought in from India, mostly to work as coolies in the rubber, tea, and oil palm estates, peasants from China were segregated in the tin mines. The local Malay peasantry were kept in their kampungs and their agricultural activities. Indeed, the imperatives of the colonial economy, which paralleled the advent and spread of pseudo-scientific, social Darwinist racial theories in Enlightenment Europe in the late 19th century culminated in the racialization of the economic, social, and political context of Malaya. There are so many ways in which race was institutionalized. The Malay Reservation Enactment legally codified who was Malay, and by extension, who could grow only rice and rubber. Segregation of space was accompanied by the British development of the field of Malay studies. Colonial ways of knowing the various inhabitants led to the emergence and proliferation of stereotypes. The British administrator, scholar Frank Swettenham observed that the leading characteristic of the Malay of every class is a disinclination to work. So pitting them against hardworking immigrant Chinese and Indians, further playing up antagonisms and entrenching differences between social groups. The latter class of governing Malay elite perpetuated these stereotypes for their own vested interests. A system of Malay and Tamil education was also established to institutionally reinforce the keeping apart as different, as separate, and as separable the social groups. The bureaucratic practice of census taking, introduced in 1871, itself underwritten by social Darwinist-inspired ideologies of racial difference and racial supremacy, was another important mechanism of colonial control. Race was first used for classification in the 1891 Strait Settlement Census. That was the third census. The first census of 1871 and 1881 used the label of nationality. Malay, Chinese, and Indian were terms that were first used as overarching racial categories in this census of 1891. By imposing a rigid grid over the mobile socio-cultural realities of the time, the classificatory apparatus of the census worked hand in hand with other colonial strategies of racial governmentality to consolidate the salience of race in the region. Indeed, the place of the census was hugely significant in the categorization and hence also homogenization of diverse national, ethno-linguistic, religious, and cultural identities and of people's different migration and settlement experiences. Their extant trans-regional connectivities and affiliations and ways of constructing community were disciplined and regulated so as to conform to the hard census labels. Race was replaced with ethnicity in the 1980 census, but it was at the start of this decade, if you remember, in 1971 also, that the concept of indigeneity was introduced into national discourse. Thus, ethnicity still functions like race as a discourse around which have been constructed practices of negative differentiation and exclusion. So, pluralism was the outcome of these contexts. The colonial administrator Furnivall defined plural society as a social formation that was based on the colonial division of labor and on institutionally imposed domination-subordination relationships. According to Furnivall, colonial Asian societies, unlike the then presumably racially homogeneous European nations, shared neither a common social will nor cultural bonds. Society was broken into three or more component sections, living side by side, but separately and with no common social life. Each segment held by its own religion, its own culture and language, its own ideas and ways of life. Furnivall theorized that the different race groups that made up plural society were so different from one another and had little in common other than their marketplace exchange. He argued that the plural society configuration was not tenable in the long run. Conflict was forestalled only because of the common economic interests of the various races. The important point here is that unlike older ways of constructing community that were forged from within, the pluralist paradigm was a narrative of social community that was imposed from above, with economic, not the cultural basis of imagined community being the organizing narrative. Now, after Malaysia became independent of the British in 1957, the state continued to adhere to many of the colonial strategies for governing an ethnically heterogeneous population. race was retained as one of the prime apparatuses of administration and control. It became an expedient tool also for political mobilization by the post-colonial state. The main constituent political partners in the ruling coalition, the Barisan Nasional, derived their origins in colonial times and were each formed on the legitimizing basis of race and race interests. The UMNO, United Malays National Organization, the MIC, the Malaysian Indian Congress, and the MCA, the Malaysian Chinese Association. Since 1971, the naturalizing and reifying of race has been principally articulated through the trope of indigeneity, which was written into state policies with the promulgation of the program of affirmative action based on race called the NEP. Under this policy of economic and social engineering, preferential treatment is accorded to ethnic Malays in higher education, government employment, and in particular occupations. This community is also granted special privileges in business licenses, land reservation, and the award of scholarships, educational grants, licenses, and permits. While the principle of social reconstruction behind the NEP itself is not problematic, its political manipulation by UMNO is. The NEP is alive until today through a series of economic guises: the NDP, National Development Policy, the National Vision Policy, and the new economic model introduced by current Premier Najib in 2010. The NEP context for establishing difference, ostensibly to correct the imbalances created by colonial rule, has worked to further fix the colonial construction of race, to reaffirm Malay racial hegemony, and to legitimize the exclusion of other races. Labels such as Bumiputra, sons of the soil, ground social and cultural difference in the naturalizing metaphor of the soil, implying a natural connection with the land and its history on the part of racial insiders, that is, those who claim continuity of belonging on national soil against the outsiders, largely the Chinese and Indians. In the exclusionary language of cultural ideologues and the conservative wing within UMNO, the dominant party serving Malay interests in the ruling coalition, who are also the prime beneficiaries of rents and concessions under the restructuring and redistributive agendas of the NEP, ethnic Chinese and Indians are the quintessential others, the pendatang, newcomers and squatters. They do not belong here as they have come from elsewhere. Race thus not only serves as a primary base for social differentiation and exclusion, but also as the prime means to political patronage and wealth accumulation. Thus, there is a need to consider the contradictions that have resulted after 55 years or so of the continued referencing of race-based procedures of post-colonial governance. In spite of the significant transformations in society arising from the changing identifications and cultural politics of minority ethnic groups, Indians and Chinese, a large majority of whom are now already third and fourth generational descendants of colonial era immigrants, are still viewed in terms of their relationship to an original homeland. The dominant discourse still frames their present identity in relation to a past and ancestral identity. This perspective relies on an approach to race that views Chineseness or Indianness as forms of identification that extend beyond the boundaries of the nation state. This nationalizing notion of race has allowed the view of people of Indian or Chinese descent who no longer live on Chinese or Indian soil, as it were, but who are still considered to be racially Chinese or Indian. This a priori view of race does not acknowledge the creative, adaptive, as well as resistant and subversive agency of individuals and communities. While the early immigrants and their immediate descendants would have regarded Indianness or Chineseness as the primary focal point of cultural identification, the vast majority of the younger generation now define their cultural identity in terms of a Malaysianness. The state's continued adherence to the essentializing MCIO paradigm in the face of these cultural shifts and transitions not only reifies race identities, but also suppresses the diversity within race categories, as well as the emergence of salient inter and even transracial affiliations that have occurred given the evolving context of history, generational, and other processes of transformative change. Yet, social, cultural, economic, and national policies are still formulated as if racial categories are pre-existing, stable, and mutually exclusive categories. Indeed, May 13, 1969, uncovered the contradictions and fissures at the heart of the nationalist narrative of imagined community. On this day, clashes broke out in Kuala Lumpur due to Malay anger over the massive gains made by the mostly Chinese-led opposition in the just concluded general elections. The politically dominant Malay community, already insecure over its weak economic standing, now felt newly threatened by the political inroads made by the ethnic Chinese, long viewed as economically superior. There were mass killings that took place over several days. Revisionary accounts of history have viewed UMNO leaders as those responsible for instigating tensions, the playing out of which were then quickly cast in oppositional Malay versus Chinese terms. Rather than working to address social grievances, the state has exploited the unheimlich terror of the race of the other. These are Homi Bhabha's terms, to consolidate its hegemony. These clashes have been named and persistently invoked as race riots, even though it was the political machineering of other Malay elites to oust the then Prime Minister from office and to replace his administration with a new Malay hegemonic economic agenda, and not race itself that played a role in it. The potential for instability in Malaysia as a social formation, central to Furnival's plural society paradigm, is the ideological justification given by the state for its intervention into and regulation of the economy and the larger life of the nation through the NEP. Even critical academic discourse has participated in this unreflexing slippage of terminology by continuing to refer to these riots as race riots. The specter of race has continued to be referenced by state leaders in moments of political crisis or national undecidability, as was dramatically evident in the immediate aftermath of the last general elections of May 2013, when the BN suffered huge setbacks, including the loss of the popular vote. The lack of reflexivity on the part of the dominant discourse was seen in the way in which state leaders automatically framed the election outcomes in racial terms. In a televised interview immediately after the incumbent government was returned to power, Prime Minister Najib attributed BN showing to its abandonment by the Chinese. The following day, the UMNO-owned Malay language daily Utusan Malaysia issued a front-page report with the headline, "Apa lagi Cina mau?" What more do the Chinese want? This indeed is the Janus-faced discourse of race that allows the state to invoke national togetherness at the same time that its elite brandish the kris to galvanize Malay support, and accompanied by chants of May 13th and Ketuanan Melayu, Malay supremacy. These are the contradictions on which the Malaysian nation is founded. Indeed, the hegemonic discourse of race constructs nation and belonging in such a way that while assuring the Chinese and Indians that they are political subjects, also keeps them from full national participation by reminding them that they are culturally from elsewhere. The state's continued implicit referencing of the plural society paradigm ultimately serves to reinforce rather than shift the terms of the engagement with race. The Race Relations Act, proposed by the government in 2011, and the Ethnic Relations Module, introduced in public universities since 2006 to mediate social interactions, reinscribe the centrality of race as a factor in social interactions. They are also underpinned by a linear view of race as stable and as autonomous objects of inquiry. In addition, by proposing to create laws that stop discrimination, the proposed Race Relations Act privileges civil and political rights in achieving equality. The assumption is that these aspects alone are enough for achieving equality. It neglects to address the full aspects of citizenship. That is, political or legal citizenship is guaranteed, but it fails to establish the cultural right of membership to the nation as a criteria of belonging. Furthermore, the meaning of tolerance that is written into the race relations paradigm is left unchallenged. The notion of tolerance implies the symbolic existence of a center, a normative race, as the privileged site from which tolerance is practiced and difference is defined. Not only is such terminology deeply revealing of the play of power and privilege in the state discourse of race, it also shores up the fantasy of the otherness of the non-Malay races. Even the state discourse of multiculturalism in the form of the National Cultural Policy of 1971, with its assimilationist underpinnings, serves to separate and segregate rather than integrate. Let us look at this advertisement. The Malaysia Truly Asia series, which is the state-sponsored Tourism Malaysia advertisement, series of advertisements by which the Malaysian government proudly and actively promotes its truly mixed panoply of Asian cultural resources for cultural and for global consumption, functions as a revealing template for hegemonic conceptions of race. This packaged form of Malaysia's multicultural realities represents the various races as standing, eating, dancing, living together, but as culturally separate and distinct from one another. Signs of the colonially constructed plural society paradigm are still in place. Malaysians are represented as living together, side by side, but not mingling. The borders separating race categories are neat and tidy. The subjects in the images are marked by or embody signifiers of race that are conventionally associated as their own. These presumptions about race naturalize the race of the subjects without complicating race categories. The dress style, the costume, dance, or musical form are familiar tropes of difference that correspond with their physical or outer appearance. These raised bodies can unproblematically be read as Chinese or Malay or Indian. Malaysianness is not represented as a transracial identity that is transcribed across boundaries and ethnicities. Ramli Ibrahim, a Malay Muslim in Indian Odyssey dance attire, Marian de Cruz, an Indian in Malay court ensemble, dancing the Joget Gamelan. They are highly transgressive images, but these won't appear in the state discourse of race. In Malaysia, truly Asia, power relations not only remain intact, they are reinscribed and reinforced through the old pillar of race. Indeed, the plural paradigm of society is incongruent with the emergence of a steadily expanding multi-ethnic middle class and their trans-ethnic solidarities. Sumit Mandal has coined this term trans-ethnic solidarities to refer to the variety of efforts whereby Malaysians actively participate in society without respect to ethnic background and by rejecting primordial notions of ethnicity. In literature, music, film, the visual and performing arts, and other sites of cultural production, there has been a transcending of the racial grids drawn by the classificatory apparatuses of state to fix and stabilize social and cultural differences. In fact, some analysts read the 2013 elections outcome as consolidating the message sent out in the preceding elections of 2008 of the irrelevance and incompatibility to local attitudes and experiences of exclusionary race-based thinking among Malaysians. So, all this has led to a situation today where race is acknowledged as a problem by researchers, but the critique of race very rarely extends beyond that. This is primarily because the social, political, cultural, and economic context and institutional arrangements of society are such that most Malaysians assume that one's race as a Malay or Chinese or Indian is fixed or a predetermined category. This has implications for knowledge production. One of the ways in which most researchers, try to get out of this bind is to replace the term race with the more overtly constructionist term of ethnicity. However, my point is that The mere substitution of race with ethnicity does not necessarily mean that the research is being conducted outside of the framework of racialized discourse or knowledge production. In fact, in Malaysian state and popular discourse, and even in much of the academic literature, race and ethnicity are often used together and interchangeably. They mean the same thing. This means that the political and ideological implications of the dominant discourse of race as a fixed signifier of difference are left unquestioned. Researchers thus still largely end up accepting race as given and unchanging, further entrenching the plural society paradigm that has long dominated Malaysian studies. How then may we use the idea of race to challenge and transform rather than to reproduce reified and reductionist race thinking? It is here that the state's articulation of a Bangsa Malaysia gains in resonance. Juxtaposed with the earlier policies or discourses of nation building, such as the Rukun Negara, national creed, which merely encouraged consensus and unity through interracial goodwill and cooperation without fundamentally affecting the hegemonic definition of race, and other central symbols of Malaysian nationhood, such as the concepts of national literature, national language, national culture, that were built around the hegemony of a core Malay culture, the ideology underlying Bangsa Malaysia offers a potentially powerful critique of the hegemonic conception of race. Former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, when introducing the concept in 1991, defined Bangsa Malaysia as an inclusive national identity for all inhabitants of Malaysia, of all colors and creeds, and as people being able to identify themselves with the country by speaking Bahasa Malaysia, the Malay language, and accepting the constitution. Malaysia, he continued, must be a nation at peace with itself, territorially and ethnically integrated, living in harmony and full fair partnership, made up of one Bangsa Malaysia with political loyalty and dedication to the nation. What is radically empowering are not Mahathir's platitudes. After all, let us not forget that Bangsa Malaysia was introduced by Mahathir in his Wawasan or Vision 2020 speech delivered at the inaugural meeting of the Malaysian Business Council. This lends credence to my view that Bangsa Malaysia, as first articulated by the state, was not so much a social or cultural narrative as it was an economic one. Not unlike Furnival's plural paradigm, in which the colonial state imposed an economic narrative to keep the otherwise tenuous social formation intact and running for the sake of economic continuity and colonial prosperity, the context in which Bangsa Malaysia was announced reveals that Mahathir was mindful of the implications of political and social crisis for Malaysia's status as part of a larger international community in an era of globalization. The vision really was an economic one: to transform the lazy natives of the colonial economies into the new Malay entrepreneurs of modern Malaysia. Be that as it may, for the first time since the 1970s, a period that witnessed dramatic state intervention in the cultural life of the nation, the leader of state himself, albeit inadvertently, had opened up a space and a forum in which Malaysians were faced with a long fantasized prospect of an inclusive Malaysian national identity. The Bangsa Malaysia concept is of special ideological value because of what the word Bangsa itself means. Although Bangsa Malaysia is commonly translated from the Malay to mean Malaysian nation, and this is a translation that the state itself has openly endorsed and put into circulation, the word Bangsa also means race. This leaves us, therefore, with the highly controversial notion of a Malaysian race, that allows us to rethink that old but still prevailing plural society and race relations paradigms and their background assumptions of difference and exclusion. This is not to say that we should fall back on thinking about race in nationalizing terms, but that we should view it as the product of social processes. It is only by invoking the meaning of Bangsa Malaysia as a Malaysian race that one can begin to rethink the traditional relationship between race and nation, diaspora and original homeland. If the dominant discourse equates a particular set of people as the true or indigenous inhabitants of the nation and excludes others, notably those whose geographical origins are viewed as lying outside national time-space, as outsiders or immigrants. Etienne Baliba, after all, warned us that the discourses of race and nation are never very far apart. Then the transgressive power of Bangsa Malaysia is that it becomes that third space of convergences and shifts, where hegemonic and people-centered notions of rootedness and belonging, indigeneity and diaspora, center and periphery, original and present homelands collide and overlap. This is the site for the creation of a new racial configuration of Malaysianness, where colonial ontologies and epistemologies of pluralism may be rejected and new knowledge produced. Li An, the embattled character of Shirley Gyoklin Lim's novel Joss and Gold, puts it succinctly. Everything in Malaysia is campur-campur, mixed, rojak. A totally new nation. No more Malay, Chinese, Indian, but all one people. For Lim, as for most Malaysians, there is no pure or original Malay or Chinese or Indian. The challenge that people like Li An or her creator Shirley Lim or the filmmaker Yasmin Ahmad or the hundreds and thousands of ordinary Malaysians like them pose to Malaysian studies is not simply that Malaysians must learn to live together by tolerating differences, but that they accept that all Malaysians are racially translated and impure beings. This conception of Bangsa Malaysia as a new race, one that is decidedly campur-campur, mixed, rojak, effectively dismantles the plural society framework inherited from the colonial project by the Malaysian nation-state at independence in 1957. In conclusion, it is time for me to pull the threads of my argument together. I have tried to show that there is a deep disjuncture between the way the Malaysian government and its discourses and official policies approach race and how society itself is evolving and experiencing, even transcending race on the ground. This has posed a serious challenge to the hegemony of the MCIO, or plural society framework, upheld by the dominant discourse. Given the significant shifts that have taken place in society, it is time to rethink and reconfigure the thought processes surrounding race. I have suggested that Bangsa Malaysia offers us an emergent paradigm to think with and through race. Thank you very much. Yes?
I was traveled by Malaysia through the Asia when I was in China. On CNN, like, English speaking all the time, I don't know how much money to spend.
Yes.
But the question is, two actual questions, one geopolitics, one theoretical. Is there any worry that, for example, given the interest of the Chinese state for Han identity and diaspora, that categorizing the MCIO will actually favor, I don't know, interest of the Chinese state towards a particular minority within Malaysia, which I'm sure is the minority of the Chinese state. And the second question, you mentioned this Bangsa Malaysia idea as thinking leading to race to the true race. I wonder if at the end the point is the end point of the argument is not to really stop using race and rethinking the idea of the nation state, which is still an old idea of the homogeneous nation state, which is possibly colonial, colonial state. But the idea that there is a nation, that the nation is also people, unity of some kind, that you have to rethink race in some way, and then in the end we just can stop talking about. We can stop talking about race.
Thank you very much, Fabio. That's a very important set of questions, especially the second one. The first one, the idea if the Chinese state's galvanizing of a Han identity has any impact on state discourse in Malaysia. Actually, irrespective of the Chinese state's galvanizing and mobilizing of Han identity, I would say that the ethnic Chinese of Malaysia do not feel a sense of cultural identification. They don't identify themselves with China, the newer generation especially. So that is something actually that I'm sure the state is also aware of. Coming to the second question, yes, I would think that the larger goal is not only to not only transcend race, because in order to transcend race, you need race in order to go beyond it, right? So that's the kind of paradox there. But it is to eliminate, to work for the elimination of race. However, that would seem an utopian, an unrealistic, an idealistic project given the racisms in society. So that would seem to be just rhetoric and utopian. It's devoid of political charge, because it's not. If you eliminate race, then how do you deal with racism? What is the concept that you're going to use to deal and critique race? That is the larger goal, and that must remain the project, because of the horrible legacies, the roots of race, the legacies of race, the painful traumas associated with race. But at the same time, race can also mean can also be a source of identification and pride for people. So we want to work with it first, right, and perhaps ultimately eliminate it. But I think that time has not yet come for us to say that we have arrived at a post-racial moment. Yes?
Thank you very much for your talk. Very, very nicely done, very well written, very well argued. But I wonder about something else. It strikes me that Malaysia is in part being torn apart by two external forces. One is the sort of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
How many of your young ladies there, how many people would object to the fact that the Malay woman does not have her hair?
Mm-hmm.
The differences in dress that are being imposed just open up the differences. I can't imagine any imam resisting the desire to talk about these naked Chinese girls in the malls and driving people apart. And on the other hand, you get this immense Chinese investment. And some of my Chinese friends in Penang and so on are disturbed about the increasing arrogance of the Chinese, which they see all the time. And Penang, Georgetown now, the Malays are moving out. It's not viable for them. My friend Walter Karim finds that race relations in Georgetown and Penang are really not very good. So I'm asking on the other side, what is the sort of poll or voting evidence that this racial identity of individuals is diminishing and it's giving way to a more national or class-based identity?
I think there are several things in the question here. One is the idea of the role played by religion. Well, that is a hugely important question and a central factor also of Malaysian life, the discourse of race. I would say that it is because of the currency of transnational, transracial identifications on the ground that the state is aware of these trans-ethnic, transracial identifications, that it has now, because race is proving to be a problematic category. It is not secure. It is not as stable as it wants it to be, as the state wants it to be. So it is now using the more, what it thinks is the more cohesive and more unifying idea of religion to practice exclusionary politics. I say this because even among the Malays, right, many of them have abandoned the MCIO framework, especially the urban middle-class Malays, for whom Malayness has come under questioning. Many of the Malays are even questioning the source of their Malayness. If it's not race, right, because of the shifts, of the cultural shifts and transitions that have taken place, the evolutionary processes of time and generational change, even the kampong, all right, with urbanization, even the kampong as a source of Malay identity has been destabilized. So many of the Malays are also turning to Islam as a new signifier of identity, a more secure signifier of their Malayness. And I feel that the state is attuned to these shifts in society, and is therefore, I mean, there's a political reason for that as well, because, you know, it wants to, UMNO wants to highlight its Islamic credentials, right, as in order to compete with the party's Agama Islam pass, and also because I think it is because of the transracial shifts that race now is proving to be quite a problematic category for the state, that it is now having to deploy the more secure category of religion in order. That is my reading of the situation. Yes, Lois?
Sharmani, I actually have 3 questions, but they're so different. I'll do one. I had a friend who was Indian by MCIO definitions and married a Chinese woman. They had children. So that's not, it might be uncommon, but I'm not sure.
It's very common for a Malay to marry for a Malay to marry a Chinese,
Okay.
for an Indian, sorry,
Indian Chinese.
yeah.
So what happens to those families? What is the MC? And this is
Yeah.
25 years ago. This
Mm.
isn't yesterday.
Mm.
It's 25
Mhm.
years ago.
Mm.
What happens to those families?
Well, yes, this has given rise to a very confused 25-year-old, in the sense that, yeah, so which box do you take? You know, because the idea of race mixed marriages also has created a group of Malaysians that are not comfortable, but they are required to take one of those boxes. Yes, that's precisely those sorts of dilemmas that I am.
But are those people, in a sense, do they help in the vanguard of cultural change, or do they find themselves afloat and discriminated in an odd way? Do they end up being a vanguard, and in the flesh vanguard of the notion of Bangsa Malaysia?
Yes, they would literally embody in their bodies the idea of Bangsa Malaysia. But I want to move beyond that kind of biological, genetic idea of race as well. You know, my idea is that you don't need to have intermarriage, because somewhere along the line we're all mixed anyway, all right? For us I would downplay that, but I would say that yes, this is becoming more and more common, the idea of mixed marriages. And yes, that is personally, it is a source of anguish for many of these children of mixed marriages, because they feel a sense of loss, that they don't fit into one of these categories. How they don't see it as a sense of gain, that they could belong to both, right? But because of the dominant hegemonic discourse that says you must belong to one or nothing, right? Not to both, right? There is anxiety.
Sorry. At
Yes.
birth, what determines the category? Is it the fathers?
Yes.
The mothers? Is it a choice between the two? Who makes that choice?
Actually, it is the father and the name. It is the father and the name, and the hospital authorities who who decide what race you belong to just by how you look, and sometimes if the mother is a Malay, then it does seem to make political sense to mark the child's race as, you know, Malay.
So it can be either father
Yes,
or mother.
but usually it's a father. Yeah.
Actually, like when we did the study, most of these kids have no problem.
Mm.
They go to school, they have to start
Yes.
school by telling what race father's race, whatever
Yeah.
father's race. But as far as if you're Muslim, by definition, you are Muslim and you're dressed in Malay clothes, you're Malay. So the woman who is Malay has married someone who is not Malay, has to become Muslim, and therefore will be Malay. So will be the child will take Malay because they fall into that category. Politically. What they are, what she's talking about is what they are inside their head. Now that's another.
Yeah. Yes, is one?
Hi, Prof. I was here a bit late. I don't know if you talked about this in your speech, but if you did, I hope you don't mind reiterating it. You spoke about MCIO. I'm a Malaysian. My dad is Chinese.
Yeah.
I'm Malay.
Yeah.
My question is that in this whole segment of MCIO, what about people in East Malaysia who we mentioned in
Yeah,
textbooks?
that's right.
Malana, Kazandu,
Yeah, yeah.
and Iban, in the idea of Bangsa Malaysia, do we really include them in it? I mean, I don't really know
Yeah.
the names of their tribes.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yes. Another way in which the MCIO does a great disservice to the nation's diversities is that it completely relegates to the status of others the indigenous tribes of East Malaysia. All these people who are Kadazan, Dusun, Malanao, Iban, Dayak, all have been relegated to others because, the MCIO, so they go under the others. Isn't that, these are the indigenous peoples of the land. Yes, that is true. They have been assigned that place.
Sharmani, would you argue that now it's actually a BCIO instead of a MCIO?
Yes, the Bumi.
Putra, Chinese, Indian, others. Bumiputra would have Malays, other Bumiputra should bring in.
Yeah. Yes, of course.
Saying the Bumiputra would include the indigenous
That's right,
East
yeah.
Malaysia?
Yeah.
So it would include the Iban.
Yes.
Yes, they are.
As long as they declare the Bumiputra should come up.
Yeah.
Other Bumiputra.
That is a political construct. The Bumiputra was a post-NEP construct, and also to shore up the Malay numbers. The indigenous tribes were the indigenous people of East Malaysia. Together collectively, Bumiputras make up about more than 60% of the population. So that's the tremendous electoral, vote there.
And that term works because Bumiputra is sons of the soil.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's like saying if you forgot about Native American Indians,
Yes.
that they are others.
Yes.
That's what it's been.
Yeah.
Native American Indians are others.
Yes.
Now you say, well, everyone's sons of the soil.
That's right. However, there's also a hierarchy within the Bumiputra category, with Malays being at the top, right? So there is a hierarchy, and not many of them who are called Bumiputra do not enjoy the privileges that the Malay Bumiputras do.
Just wondering about these large forces that kill.
Yeah. Yes.
So you
I was just coming to that.
yeah, you have Islam, and of course groups like Hindra with
Yeah.
Indian.
Yes.
Also often slash Hindu.
Yes.
Not always. But, people forget about the Indian Christians.
Yes. Yes.
And then, of course, now Christianity is like looming large, So you have like these three main religions. Of course, a minority of sort of Chinese and Bumiputra Christians. And so are we going to be, in the near future, dealing with religion or race or both, or sort of religion, race goes by the side, Bangsa it's a big picture now, just sort of how you foresee the sort of near future.
Yes. Yes, the future is grim. The near future even grimmer. I would say that I was just thinking of your one aspect of your question, Gail, about the Chinese arrogance. My reading of things is that the more you persecute and the more you marginalize, the more strident one is going to be about defending one's ethnicity, about using it as a vanguard for inclusion. The moment you are relaxed and inclusive, people will stop identifying. in terms of their, ancestral identities, and they will be more open to being part of the nation, really. So yes, this is a very, whatever, whether it's religion or race, the religion also works on the same principle of differentiating, to me. So the approach to identity is still the same.
I was struck by the fact that a pluralistic society.
Yes.
I know this is focused on Malaysia, but of course there are many. The United States, minus its colonial
Yes.
heritage, including our destruction of the natives. But we all have that same problem, and as you said, it takes a certain amount of cohesion on the part of the others, the different groups, to maintain that. And the more the hierarchy is established, the more they will identify as themselves and keep themselves separate on their own to maintain a sense of pride. But the one question I wanted to ask with regard to Malaysia, in this country also with our census, we had certain categories that we were working with. And having come from an employment in social research, I know how switching those categories around can confound any historical research. But do the people in Malaysia have the option, they choose their own? In the case of our daughters, for example, they could have chosen white, they could have chosen Southeast Asian as a racial category. But they hesitated to choose either because they thought they were insulting one or the other of us.
Yeah.
So that feeling of discomfort with a racial, biological melding of races
Yes.
is understood, and it's not just in Malaysia. But to get back to my original question, can someone in this country, when they're filling out the census, they choose? In Malaysia, must they choose the ethnicity or race of the father?
Yeah, I was speaking to Charles Hirschman last year about the census, and he had said that in the last census there was no what do you call it? Usually the interviewers go with their census form and then they tick the box for you, even without asking what race you belong to. But now the option is given to the household to determine to tick whatever box they please. So there's no coercion. You tick whatever box pleases you. But when you have 4 boxes in front of you, and so what do you take? And sometimes it is so conflicting. It's so confined anyway to those just 4 identities. Most people will be just to make sense. It's just logical to tick Indian rather than Chinese. Depending on your ethnic background. And also, in spite of this. Of the interviewers being told not to tick the boxes, they do it anyway. They do it. Automatically, they tick it for you. And there's also a box on religion. And if it's an Indian household, they tick Hindu. Automatically, even though there's the picture of the last scene, last dinner, supper. Is that the Last Supper? Yeah, with Christ in the middle in the dining room. And she's sitting there at the dining table, ticking Hindu. And there was a crucifix on the door as she entered the house. So these are all these stereotyped, which is so difficult to displace. And of course, the U.S. Context is also different from Malaysia because in the sense that U.S. is a nation that is continuing to receive immigrants. But in Malaysia, by the 1930s, large-scale immigration from India and China had already ceased by then. So many of these, what the state calls Chinese and Indians, are actually 3rd to 4th generation Malaysians already. So, and their sense of identification with Malaysia is going to be stronger rather than first generation Americans, all right, who would still feel a sense of identification with the cultures of the countries they come from. So that kind of history is different. Yes, Branislav?
What about textbooks? For example, when you were a student and now you're kids, for example, how much have the textbooks changed over time? Because now what we have in Europe, for example, there are many projects aimed at almost changing textbooks when it comes to the presence of Muslims in Europe, when it comes to the increasing present member states of the European Union. Somehow we are trying to adjust the textbooks.
Yeah, definitely textbooks have been tampered with, especially history textbooks, where, you know, one good example is all the contributions to nation building of the Chinese and Indian communities have been erased. So once upon a time, Yap Aloy, was officially acknowledged as the founder of Kuala Lumpur. It is now, who's it? Sultan Abdullah? Raja Abdullah? Yeah. So it is this tampering with history that is taking place, and brazenly, because this is the kind of history that our children are made to read, which relegates the contributions to the nation by the other communities, to the silences of history. So definitely that is happening, the rewriting of history through the school textbooks, especially history.
On that happy note, join me in thanking Dr. Gabriel.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.